So that is after we've done step 1, 2, and 3, which is about setting objectives, finding the right sort of risks to focus on, or the core consequence scenarios that we came up with. And then the third topic was all about people, how to include the right people in your organization in those business continuity teams. That was the first 3 steps. Now we really should, especially now that we have some people that we can talk to in that organization, we should really be looking at what is time critical. And this is actually, this 4th step is about BAU processes, business as usual, daily processes. This is really not looking in any way at disasters yet, or impacts on those processes. We're talking purely about on an average day in your organization, what are the time critical activities, processes, and resources that you're actually, that you can nominate that have to be maintained during any type of situation. So on a daily basis, what is important to the business. Now, traditionally, what happens with that is people talk about mission critical. I already said yesterday, I don't like the word mission critical so much. It's more about time criticality. So that's what you'll see over here. I talk a lot about time criticality. I believe every person in a business is actually mission critical. Otherwise, you wouldn't be working there. So I like the idea of saying not mission critical or business critical. I actually like the word time critical, so that it suggests to people we're talking about time frames. When does what are time critical and prioritized sort of activities, where there's a time sensitivity to an activity. That's more important than saying mission critical. Yeah, mission critical sounds very much like the army. I don't think it applies to business at all. I think it's a term that's really outdated. So time critical or time sensitive or prioritized activities, that's probably a more suitable term. Traditionally, people give a whole bunch of departments, and maybe you guys have done that as well. Maybe you've given people in all the different departments in your organization a template to fill in all their BIA requirements, their BCP, strategies. But what I traditionally do is I first look at top-down processes in that organization and look at what are the time critical ones, and then from there break it down into what are the time critical activities and resources, and which departments play a role in those activities. Yeah, so not just like, oh, well, every department is time critical, or a whole department is yes or no time critical. I don't believe that that's the right way to go. I think it's all about looking at which activities are time critical that fit in those time critical processes as well. Yeah, so that means you're actually really prioritizing even within departments what is time critical. An example would be the finance department in an organization. You might find that they are doing certain things that are always time critical, like they have to, for example, have a process for urgent purchasing. Like if you need to make urgent purchases, that may be a very time critical process during any situation, whether it's a day-to-day process or a disaster situation. So that could be a time critical process, but things like financial reporting and budgeting and stock take, those things may not be so time critical, especially if we're starting to look in step 5 at what impacts could actually happen to these activities. So if you know what I mean, like it's basically for each department to nominate how they participate in those time critical processes that you've nominated, the top-down kind of simple set of processes. And then from that point on say, okay, which activities are you doing in your department that actually fit there? And the other things, maybe you can park them for a week or a day or a couple of days or a year, So that's how I would approach that. In a traditional sort of environment, I see people doing a lot of silo approach, whereas I'm usually mapping into the dependencies between different departments, so not so silo based. I tend to focus more on restoring assets and on activities and resources and the related assets and resources, whereas in the past you see people more on all the assets, for example, the whole IT. How can we back that up? How can we make that available elsewhere? And not really looking at what that IT is used for. So I see people over-investing a lot in the traditional method, and in our method we're really specific on what is actually time critical, because In real disasters, I see people like IT and facilities running around, and a lot of the time they're running around for the wrong people. The people with the loudest voices, the people with so-called stress levels about what they're supposed to do that day. I need a mobile phone. I need an application, set up straight away. I need data. But in reality, that's often not actually time critical what they're doing. So I think it's really important that we get that clear, and that we give some breathing space to people in IT and facilities, not having to run around like crazy for the wrong people. Then the last point there is prioritizing activities, of course, what's time critical and not so much departments. So that's all similar. Now, a high-level overview of any organization would be something like this. So you're talking about the overall high level of the organization. You can see in there aims and objectives, some key processes or any process really that is happening in there. And processes are really a combination of activities, customer groups, products, services, So how I would see that is things like, okay, for example, a company like Vodafone, I think in Malaysia they're called Vodafone as well, Vodacom or Vodafone, they would have an end-to-end process, for example, of providing data services to retail customers. Now that would be an end-to-end process. Another end-to-end process they might have is providing telephony services to businesses. Yeah. So it's a combination usually of a product or service and a group of customers. And that's how you'd like to define those processes. And they sound really high level, what I just said, but that's exactly how you should approach that, because they should make sense to anyone in the business. So then from those processes, you're going to be able to break down in what activities are happening and who's doing those activities, in which departments. And then supporting activities that are happening across the board. So things like someone picking up a post every day, someone doing recruitment for the organization. I mean, they are a little bit hard to say, oh, that's only for that activity. Usually that's for a whole bunch of activities or for multiple processes. Yeah, you might have people working in a call center in Vodafone who actually could handle all those inquiries across different processes. Well, that would be in the assets and resources realm then. If those people work there, they could actually support the whole business. So some things are specific for a process, like an activity or department or resource, and other things are really generic, the supporting activities and assets. And then you've got on the left-hand side here some outsourced products and services. You might have a partnership with another organization. Could be a call center service that Vodafone has purchased, like so that they're ongoingly utilizing maybe from a different country. And those people also have supporting activities and assets and resources. And that's where it gets difficult, because those people actually are not 100% under your control. So you need to know what are their business continuity plans, how do they actually manage all of that, because you can build that plan for them. Well, most of the time you can't, or you're not doing that. That's their own problem. But you want to know what they have in place, though. So it's interesting, yeah. So it's a bit of a dialogue going on there. And at the top level, that's where you've got your strategic plans and stakeholders. So on the top right here, that's the people you need to talk to validate some of the material you've actually produced here in this chart. You want them to actually approve it, to say, hey, does this make sense? Because the top will probably understand from the top down what those processes are. They may not know what's happening at the detail level, at the supporting activities and at the assets and resources level. Yeah, but yet they will probably know at the top-down level what's the situation. Let me just read what chat message is there from Ismail. Thank you. For urgent purchase scenario, apart from finance department, procurement team is also involved. Would that mean that the procurement team needs to be categorized as critical too? Well, not the whole team. That's the whole point. There may be one activity in procurement that may be time critical, and that is your emergency purchase procedure, the urgent purchase procedure. So in each department, procurement, but also finance, but also IT, but also HR, etc. There are activities that are time critical and other activities that are not. And what we do is we justify those time critical processes based on their time-critical activities we justify based on how they participate in the time-critical processes. So it's basically a matrix that you can build. I normally build a framework where, and I can show you an example during the break, but on the top we put all the time-critical processes of the business, usually 5, 6, 7 of those, not too detailed either, like it has to be at a fairly generic level. And then on the left-hand side, I'll write all the departments in there. And then under each of those columns, i.e. processes, we tick or we describe how that department plays a role in that particular process. And if there's other activities that the department is doing, like procurement, there's also all sorts of things that in a disaster situation you're not going to worry about. You know, they may be doing regular contract reviews and updating, contact details of suppliers and stuff like that. I mean, that's great, but in a disaster situation, you probably can park some of those things. But it's a very good question, and Ismail, the virtual chocolate goes to you today already. Really, a really good question, because it is that matrix type approach. I hope you guys can all see that. And what I also wanted to show with the next picture is you're actually in business continuity planning, you're going to select those processes and related activities, supporting activities and resources, the ones that actually make sense during a disaster to maintain, to keep alive. So that's what we talked about earlier. For example, the process of budgeting and financial reporting, you might say, oh, we'll of course get an extension on that. We don't need that to continue during the disaster the whole time. Let me just turn off the sound. Oh, I can't do that. Marion, do you mind trying to turn off the sound of when people enter? Yeah, there's a beeping happening when people enter or exit. All right, so during the mapping of these processes, you're going to try and find out what is time critical to that business. And there's a whole range of reasons why something is time critical. And I've got in the handout that you'll receive later, it will have those sorts of criteria, like financial impact, of course, if that process is not happening, or reputational impact if that process is not happening, or the legal and compliance impact, or managerial impact, or relationship impact with other parties. So all of those impacts you're going to use to justify whether a process is going to be red or whether it's a yellow and it can be actually staying out of the BCP. You don't need it in case of an incident. So this is a fairly complex process, and it already is complex in peacetime when there's no disasters or anything, right? So can you imagine during a disaster itself, during a complex incident, then having to determine what is time critical is double hard, because now you don't have the right people there and everyone's panicking and they all seem to think that what they're doing is super urgent, but in a normal day-to-day BAU situation, you can work these things out, you can agree on it. And if you've got the situation, which I find quite a lot, that certain people think they're not time critical or they don't really have an interest in BCP, they want to stay out of it, they don't want to spend the extra time. That's one situation. Those people, you need to really check, are they critical in your process map that I just described? Are they critical to other people to continue the processes? So if one of the activities here is done by a department that is not really buying into the whole thing and they're not interested, etc., that's where you need to use people from the other departments, who are involved in the other activities to motivate them. Because if you start, waving that stick, it's not going to work, I find. It's really an opportunity to put people together in a room or in a virtual discussion, via whatever Zoom or something, and to say, hey, let's walk through this process, top down, see what activities are happening and who's doing those activities. And if someone's missing or if there's someone there who seems to be not interested, the others in that room will highly likely inspire that person to be more involved because they know they're dependent on that person. Yeah, so if you can use that tactic, that would be fantastic, That's really important because it's not about you waving that stick and say, you must do your activity, you must be involved in BCP, yeah? Another situation is when people are overly interested. I mentioned that earlier as well. If people think that they're really time critical, but in reality, that what they're doing is not that important. It's not, well, it's important, but it's not going to be important during an incident. so their work is not really time sensitive. With those groups, I actually really try to find how they can participate as backups, as secondary people, you know, what their skill sets are. Can they actually help with the bright red processes here? If they're working in these sorts of areas, I want them to, in the yellows sort of section, I want them to actually see if they can participate in those time critical processes. Because often you need backup staff, you need extra people to help out with these things. I'm just going to read a little bit what is in the chat and see if I can answer a few things. We've covered that one. I can see a question here from Harry. How would you define time? I mean, certain process would be critical if the disruption is for 1 week, but it's required to be performed when the disruption is for 3 months. So how would we determine which process continues critical business function? So there's two things, two dimensions to that. One is during any incident, even at the worst time of the day or month or year or week, you know, so assume worst case in terms of timing, which could be the day before payday, for example. Yeah. On that worst day of the month, is it then required urgently to do that process? And urgent, we find every organization finds that differently, because if I have a bucket load of money to invest in BCP, I could say, I'm going to safeguard any process that is needed within a month or 2 months or 3 months, as you said. Other organizations say, look, I don't think I've got that budget. I will focus on the processes that are needed within the first week or 2 weeks. And as we go along, we will work out for the other processes, for the other activities, how we can recover them. We're not going to have a full BCP for things that are not needed for the first 3 months. But keep in mind, you're doing this for the worst possible time. So, for example, if you've got really important, critical legislative requirements once a year that you have to report on, you know, I've got some clients and they have OH&S reporting, workplace health and safety related reporting. And they say, look, if we don't do that on that day or by that date, you know, we're really, you know, we're going to be hammered. We're going to lose our license to operate with our factory, for example. Now, that's an example of if it's the worst time of the year, it could be needed within the first, in their case, within the first week, you know, that they actually build that report and send it off to the government or something. So in that case, that process, that activity actually does enter our BCP. You know, that becomes one of the processes that we're going to cover. But if something can wait, even if it happens on the worst day of the year, and it can wait for at least 3, 4, 5 weeks, most of the organizations I work for say, we leave it. We're not going to make a whole BCP for that. It's just, we don't have the budget, you know, and we can handle probably with manual workarounds to a certain degree. We'll stretch those manual workarounds and just try and make it work that way. The only exception to that approach is your RPOs, you know, your data backups, your recovery point objectives. I'm saying something that I'll explain later in the course, but some of you know what RPOs are. So that's basically your backups. Your data backups, you cannot decide on the day, is it important or not? You're going to have to, even if you say we're going to recover the process in 3 months' time, the data still has to be somehow available historically, you know, from before the incident. So that's the only thing that you do include in your BCP for all activities, some determination on how frequently do you back it up. I hope that makes sense, because data backups, you're looking back in time. When was the last backup? Whereas all the other stuff like incident, you know, response and recovery, it's from the moment of the incident forward. And you could say theoretically, well, okay, if something is, you know, not immediately urgent, we can work it out later on and we'll find a way to recover that process, you know, to get software, to get people, to get a room, to get a fax machine, whatever it is. We can do that during the first couple of weeks of when the time critical processes are being addressed. So that's how I would normally approach that. Yeah, and there'll be multiple examples coming in the next sort of half an hour where you'll see, this is how that works, you know, how it will be charted and how do I determine that criticality. Because it's all right to say everybody's important and time sensitive, but you won't be able to help everyone from the first moment. And IT people know this, you know. So, but other people too, facility staff and HR, etc., and marketing and those people, they know also they can't help everyone at the same first moment. So the way to sell it back to those who think they're time sensitive, but in reality you can't help them because it's really not that time critical, that the work that they do. If you want to sell the concept to them, say, look, if everyone is labeled time critical, we won't be able to help everybody on time. We don't have the budget for that. So we need to be very selective beforehand so that we at least can help those people that we've labeled time critical, you know, those departments, those activities, those processes, etc., and assets and resources, all of the stuff that is actually time critical. We can confidently help them and make that work. And then we have potentially some breathing space to start working on the rest. That's the right approach. Not offering a promise to everybody, oh, we'll be helping you first up. And then in reality, you're helping all the wrong people, the one with the loudest voices and the ones with, you know, really not time critical work. So I hope that makes some sense. Yeah, so that was the question there. Then we have Islani. In some organization, procurement is very important when the margin is critical. Yeah, absolutely. And that's really the top-down decision then. Hey, procurement, we have to keep going because that's important for margins, you know. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. But I'm saying for other organizations, it might just be a part of your procurement activity or procurement department that is actually time critical. And some people say, this is also as one, I've seen organization being driven by procurement effective cost structure. Yeah. And I've also seen people who work in quoting, for example, who work out costings and things, which sounds very inward focused, like, oh, that we don't need that in a disaster. But they say, well, without me, the rest of the business can't sell. And without selling, within a couple of days, we'll be bankrupt, you know. Some businesses have enormous amounts of backup funding, and they can handle, you know, a downtime of a month. During COVID, we've seen the same things. You know, there's businesses that say, you know, I actually, I'm being supported by the government, but my business is gone. You know, I can't not work for a month in that business and continue to serve customers, or the customers will be gone forever. Yeah. So yeah, it really depends on each business. What are those time critical processes? And we'll be doing some work on that, which will be really interesting to say, hey, this is for us really seen as a time critical process. But others in the same group here might say, oh, for us that's nothing, you know, like we don't do that part. And it sounds like procurement is an interesting one to discuss in that regard, also in the breakout rooms later on, you know, to say how does that work for your particular business. Great, and thank you for asking the questions. It's very, very helpful. All right, so I love this picture. This is a picture of the elephant and the 6 blind men. I don't know who knows it, but it's a picture where an elephant sort of goes to the edge of the village, and the village has never seen an elephant, and they're sending 6 blind men to describe the elephant in more detail. And the guy at the front here, at the trunk, is saying elephant is like a hose. The guy at the tail thinks it's like a rope, and the guy at the belly, it's like, this is like a wall. The guy at the leg thinks an elephant is like a pillar, and the guy at the ear thinks it's like a fan, and the guy at the tusk, I always get those confused, tusk and trunk. So the tusk, they always think, well, it's like a pipe, you know. So what you see in there is a whole bunch of people who are describing the elephant. And the question is, well, who's correct, you know? And maybe you guys can help there. Who of these 6 blind men is correct? Who described the elephant correctly? Please type away in the chat. So which of the 6 blind men is correct in describing the elephant? No one knows the answer. Ooh, this has happened before. I'm happy to answer it then. The answer is, in my view, actually, all of them are correct, and none of them are correct. It's both. The first of all, well, all of them are correct because that's all they can see. You know, these people are blind, so they see only, or they see with their hands, and all they're able to do is touch with those two hands. So where they're describing the elephant in their limited way. And what I would say is, in most organizations, that's how anyone in the organization would describe the organization if they don't work in those departments. Like, nobody in the organization knows every single detail that happens in every single department in the organization. So I'm hoping that makes sense, yeah? And you, as a BCP coordinator or facilitator, are actually the one that is starting to see the whole elephant, because you're going to talk to all the different business departments. You're going to put that elephant together to say, hey, where does the elephant have 3 legs or 5 legs? You know, you'll see that in your work. You know, you'll see that there's certain departments that are overly active, and maybe there's duplicated effort going on, you know, with other departments who are doing the same sort of things. So if you're doing BCP, you're starting to see how the whole thing hangs together, the whole organization, i.e. the whole elephant. And it's important to realize that if you do see there's 5 legs on the elephant, you know, and there's extra activities happening or duplicated activities, that people don't have fear for you, that information goes to, for example, the upper management, and to say, hey, we need to sack a few people, you know, get rid of a few people. That's not actually what you want. So building the trust and having some rules around it so that you are purely on a mission to build business continuity plans, and not, you know, to tell people that, you know, they should be doing something else or whatever. You're not re-engineering the BAU. Yeah, and that's fairly sensitive, because there will be people who are reluctant to tell you how much or how little they are doing every day. You know, they'll be maybe overly stating it because they want to be seen as really important, and they're worried that if they don't say their time critical, that you might think, oh, well, why are they working here? What are they doing all day long? So yeah, you need to build some confidence around that with these people, some, how should I say, some trust. And also you need some rules from your managers, from the upper management, to say, what do I do in that situation? And my advice with that is, well, you're not hired to do it. Don't get into that position of people being fearful of telling you the truth, because you don't want to be seen as someone who actually has a hidden agenda here. So I think you've got a clear statement or clear point from senior management to tell them that, and for them to purely assume that what you're doing is coming up with plans, reviewing your BCP, coming up with new thoughts on that, and not re-engineering the whole business and finding where people could be removed from that business, you know. So that's maybe something you've already noticed in your life as well. Okay, next. The next page here is about time-critical activities and resources, which we saw in the previous picture there, the blue one. What you're doing there is identifying those, but also looking for bottlenecks and single points of failure. So you're looking at situations where there's a dependency on certain key people. That could be internal or external people. Could be certain key parts of facilities or buildings, etc., or outsourcers that are doing certain activities. So in those situations, you're going to try and find, as soon as possible for those situations, you're going to try and find backups. Because if there are key people, I've seen that in various parts of the organization. Sometimes it's someone who does facilities and knows about the diesel generator in the building. That's often one person who knows everything. I've also seen many businesses where the network engineer of, you know, the organization, like the IT department, has a couple of key people there that don't have too much backup. You know, like if they're sick or if they're not there, there's going to be a bit of a risk there. So what you're trying to find is immediately look for those backups in those particular situations. Yeah, you're just really trying to find a low-hanging fruit, as they call it. And then you're going to spend time on the rest. So this is a model that you could look at as just an example there. You know, the time-critical processes up the top, and as I mentioned earlier, the teams or divisions on the left, and you can then plug in there little ticks or a description. You could do a whole description in there on if or how that department plays a role in that particular time-critical process. And this particular business, we said, responding to phone inquiries, selling services to new and existing customers, and order processing are the actual time-critical processes for that business. There may be a couple more. And what we've done there is look at activities, resources, and then each department that plays a role in there. Yeah, and that you could describe that in more detail if you want. So that was the initial step in there to start getting into our BIA, because with the information from step 4, we now know what time-critical processes do we have and what are the business impacts that we're going to calculate on those. Now, sometimes this is a bit iterative, because if you find out in step 5 that there's actually additional activities that actually didn't seem time critical before, but when you look at them in step 5, they seem more critical or more, you know, not single points of failure, but critical elements in other processes, you sometimes find out later, well, that's fine. Then, you know, go back to step 4, do some realignment. Yeah, BCP is very iterative. Yeah, I've put a picture of the wheel for that reason, not a top-down, you know, structure that you find in most standards and that. It's not a project, you know, it's not a top-to-bottom approach. It's a circular approach where you're embedding that process in the business, and then as you go along, you're going to optimize it. Are there any questions about business processes that we defined earlier? Any further comments? And I'm really happy to see so many comments in the chat, because that's actually very helpful that you guys vent and ask what goes on there. So. Okay. Well, in that case, we'll go to step 5, which is our business impact analysis. The questions to ask yourself, or the business around you, is what do you do? Who's involved? Where is it done? When is it done? Critical timings. How does it happen? What is needed? Why is it done this way? Now, that's a bit of a touchy question. You might want to be careful with that one, because many people would probably know, well, it's always been done this way, and that's why, you know, maybe there's no real honest answer to that. And then the last point there, what's the worst time something could happen, you know? Now, the dot in there, what's the worst time that X, Y, Z could happen, or any other questions that you've got above that, what you can use is your key consequence scenarios from step 2. In step 2, we said, okay, loss or impact on staff, loss or impact on facilities, there's a loss or a critical impact on various scenarios that we could think about. You know, or it was also an impact on telephony, or on ICT, or on a key supplier. Yeah, do you guys remember that situation where we had the breakdown in those different consequence scenarios? Now, with those, even just with those, even if you didn't have all the other incidents that we talked about yesterday in the risk matrix, even if you just stick with those consequence scenarios, we actually can ask these questions from business departments. So, for example, if I ask a procurement department, to stick with procurement, what is the worst time that a loss of staff, you know, an illness of most of your people could happen? Well, they might say that day of the month, or that day of the year, or that week of the year, you know, because there's certain time critical activities happening. Or they could say any day, any time. You know, for some impacts, it doesn't matter when it happens, it's always as bad as it can be, because that business is maybe working on that process all day long. You know, they're actually conducting those activities all day long. So, yeah, so that's an important point to remember, that the business department that you're going to ask these questions, based on the time critical processes and the core consequence scenarios, they need to, feel that sort of simplicity, that you're not coming to them with scenarios that are more incident level, you know, of your risk matrix. Like incidents, you could have things like, I don't know, cyber attacks, or failure of a IT supplier, or human error in IT. The business departments don't know what the difference between all of that is in terms of the impact or what they should do about it. So they actually should just think about the consequence scenario, you know, when we talked about the impact of it. Okay, how bad is it? Yeah, that's what we're working with. And that how bad is it could be loss of IT. That's probably the description you want to give them. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense there. There's a comment here in the chat. Urgent purchase by procurement team handling media by corporate comms are samples of time-critical functions during a particular crisis or disaster. Why not just park them on the CMP instead of BCP? Yeah, interesting. The difference between crisis management planning and the BCP is how much in terms of provisions are required for those. So if you say, look, for example, a media handling by the corporate comms, I can see that that could be in your crisis management plan because you don't have to build a whole heap of nuts and bolts behind it, except, the media liaison person maybe having a mobile phone or something, which is a fairly simple thing. But if you're talking about urgent purchase procedure, you're not bringing that under your CMP, because who is going to build, get the system access and all the things that are needed for that urgent purchase procedure? You'll need a certain key staff, you'll need, like I said, a certain system, maybe someone taking photos with a mobile phone. There needs to be a procedure for all of that, but also resources that need to be recovered by, for example, IT or facilities. Now, if there's a whole heap of that activity needed, I would bring it under your BCP because you're going to come up with some strategies around that, to actually recover the nuts and bolts, the facilities, the desks, the phones, the seats, the fax machines, the mobile phones, etc., and the access to systems, etc., as well, and laptops and whatever. So if all of that is needed for it, it's really a BCP thing. That's what I would say. If it's purely no comment to the media, or yes, lots of comments to the media, or a guideline, that could be under your CMP, and especially if it's applicable to all different scenarios. Yeah, so it's not, certain things are not so scenario specific, and that's when you can maybe lift it up to the CMP level. We have a bit of a hybrid approach. Every organization has different kind of needs. It's not always the same kind of approach for every business. So we tend to sort of work with every organization to see what is most suitable for them. I hope that answered your question, Melissa or Ismail, sorry. Yeah, that's maybe just respond back if that covers what you're asking. Yeah, BCP is really looking at strategies to recover certain key resources and activities and all the nuts and bolts. And it's a more specific approach for each activity and process and department and all that. Whereas CMP tends to be more across the board, certain guidelines on, like you said, dealing with the media or handling a critical investigation or things. And it's a lot more about comms, communication and decision making. So yeah, that's the difference there. Just going to check if you responded. Great. Thank you very much. Right, impact of scenarios on time-critical processes. Now, this is what we just, basically a recap of what I just said. You're going to match that scenario of step 2 or the scenarios, you're going to match them with these time-critical processes and then see how bad is it if they don't function. So could it be financial impact if we don't operate a certain process? Like you guys mentioned procurement. There are certain activities, if you don't do them, it's going to be an immediate financial impact. One of you guys mentioned. It could also be for other businesses that there's no financial impact, but maybe a operational or other miscellaneous impact, like reputation, legal, compliance, quality of work, comfort level of staff, impacts on other organizations or the community, customers' business results, supplier relationships, the national economy. All of these could also be impacts. And they may be sometimes not as easily quantifiable, but they can be quantified, especially when you're using ratings. So it's not, maybe you can't say immediately like, oh, reputational damage is immediately quantifiable to a certain ring-it level, or a certain ring-it type impact, but you can quantify certain levels of it, saying how much negative news coverage is there, for example. If it's a level 1, that means only one small article locally, but level 5 would be, persistent negative media coverage in the news because of this incident and the impact on our organization of that. So you could still use with ratings, you can still quantify some of these more softer aspects, the miscellaneous kind of impacts. And with the first one, yeah, that can be quite tangible, of course. You might have financial impacts due to extra expenses you have to make in a critical incident. You might have revenue loss, income loss, penalties from customers if you don't operate for a while, market share loss. Yeah, so these tend to be more easily quantifiable in terms of financial aspects, impact. Now, maximum tolerable period of disruption, what we're trying to find with this is when we have each of these time critical processes here, yeah, so we've got the process A, B, C, D, there may be more, but usually we aim for 5 to 7 at the top-down level. Yeah, if it's more than that, I usually find it's actually activities, they're not processes. So I try to always maintain that sort of approach, no more than 7. So the first one, responding to phone inquiries, and the second one, order processing and delivery. This is, for example, for a factory, or business, the manufacturing business. Some of those we can now start labeling as no matter when. And others you might find, they're only certain times of the month or day or year. So, for example, paying staff and long-term contractors and paying time-critical suppliers. That's C and D. They could be only a certain time of the month, for example, that they're time-critical. Now, as we assume worst-case scenario could happen, what we're saying here is we do put these processes in our BCP because it could happen on payday, right? Like I said earlier. But because we know this little box above, like saying it's only certain times of the month or year, we can then say on an actual day of an incident, are they time critical on that day, and will they be bumped up, to become level 1 level A or B, because some of these other time critical activities, maybe they're not as time critical as paying staff on the wrong time of the month. So the second category there, C and D, is a little bit more fluid, flexible in terms of how time critical they are. Now, another thing that we like to do is say, okay, how long can we apply certain workarounds, manual workarounds to these processes? And we're going to do that in a nitty-gritty sort of way in our BCP on a page, but here we've kind of summarized that to say, based on the impacts of our previous slide, let me just go back there, these impacts, right? Could be lots of different impacts there. If those impacts were to hit these time critical processes, and based on a certain incident, like a loss of staff, or loss of building, loss of IT systems, what would be then the tolerable period of disruption, the MTPD, maximum tolerable period of disruption? What can we justify there? And based on which impact? How long is that? Because how long can we do things manually, for example? How long don't we need a full solution? And the justifications can go something like this. In process A, you might say we make an average percentage of conversion rate on incoming calls from potential customers. That means we're selling a percentage of all the calls that come in, where we respond to phone inquiries, will become actual customers. And they will become actual sales to those customers, and maybe persistent sales. So what is actually the value of losing an afternoon, for example, or 2 business days of that particular activity? Well, it could be this level of ring it, that we normally would convert in an afternoon or in a 2-day period. Now, in this case, we're saying the 2 business days is the maximum we can handle there, that we have the appetite for. Yeah, and some of these things come back to risk appetite, which is a whole different topic for senior management to determine. But let's say that they have an appetite not to lose more than 2 business days worth of business because it equates to a certain ringgit value. Well, okay, that can be described based on that justification. And the justification comes with the impact. Like I said, could be financial impact in that process A. Could be things like reputational impact for process D or C or B, when we have really a disruption to our order processing and delivery. That could be a reputational impact as well as financial, because customers start complaining, they maybe put things on Facebook and all that sort of stuff that you don't want. So the impact of a disruption is one dimension or variable to keep in mind. And the other thing, like I said earlier, is the quality of your workaround. A workaround is a temporary measure that you can activate when an incident happens. You can say for a period of time, we will activate that manual workaround or initial workaround, and it will keep us going to a certain degree. And it will keep customers happy enough, for example. So in the second process, which is process B, order processing, what we said there for this example of an organization, this manufacturing company, we said for 2 weeks, they can actually use manual workaround by, for example, doing things slightly differently, if a incident were to strike across any of the scenarios, like loss of staff, loss of building, loss of systems, whatever the scenario is, we can, for 2 weeks, we can handle manual workarounds. So for example, it says here, although the customer has already been converted, delivering the product and taking final payments and related professionalism and reputation and cash flow would be impacted in case of extreme delays beyond 2 weeks. But initially, we can maintain that reputational and professional level. For 2 weeks, it's okay. For that third one, paying staff, we're saying up to 4 weeks, we can run these manual workarounds because the impact of staff is minimal and can be addressed manually for an individual case where an incorrect salary has been paid. Now, I can already say that with this particular organization, the manual workaround was to ring the bank and to pay all the staff the same as last month. That was their manual workaround. If their systems were down, if they couldn't get the actual exact data of how much everybody should get paid, they said that's what we do. And any discrepancies we fix manually. You know, we either ask the staff to get paid less next month if we overpaid them accidentally, or if we underpaid them, you know, we will fix that next month, or we give it a manual payment or something. That kind of strategy I've seen I work quite a lot in East Africa and places like that where there's limited capacity for any sort of automated systems, and you know, infrastructure sort of recovery is fairly limited in terms of options. So they have to be very creative with their manual workarounds. And one of them was, we just pay, if a payroll system is down, we just pay every staff a certain minimum level so they can keep going, and they do weekly payments there, by the way. So the payment that they're going to get is just an average staff member or a lower level staff to get for a week. That same level, we're going to pay all the staff for that week initially, and we're going to do that with mobile money. Now, for them, that means they're going to actually go to someone on the street, like an agent who does mobile money, which sends money to people's mobile phones. And their workaround is to get that cash quickly. They pay with cash. They get that quickly paid with mobile money to all the staff members, so they have a minimum level they can use that month. And mobile money is not as popular, I think, in Asia, but you may have seen it here and there. You can send staff money via their mobiles. And what they did in Africa, in that particular organization, they said, that's good enough. For 4 weeks, we can handle that. And if there's any staff that have particular issues, we will fix that manually. We will send them some extra cash or whatever. We'll look at what their salary is, because we remember, HR may remember roughly what their salary level was. Even if the whole payroll system is down, we can give at least people enough to get by, you know. And they're not using their own systems. They're using the guy on the street who does the mobile money, you know, selling of the little vouchers you can then give staff. So very interesting workaround. And paying time-critical suppliers, very similar to that, but that one, they said for 2 weeks, we can actually tell our time-critical suppliers that they agreed on a delay of payment. You know, so in your contracts with suppliers, you could put that if you have a disaster as a company, you're going to pay your suppliers 3 times slower. Yeah, so normally you pay them every whatever month, or within a month. In a case of you having a disaster, you could put a clause in there to say, we pay you after 3 months instead. Now, for most time-critical suppliers, you know, if they've agreed on that, you could activate that process. You just have to tell them, you know, you inform them proactively. You make sure that they know, oh yeah, this is, you know, the company that I'm, you know, expecting money from is now having a technical issue, and they're going to pay me later. And most situations, you can handle that. The only suppliers where that's a problem is actually not the big ones that are so time critical, it's actually the smaller ones. You know, you could say the smaller time critical suppliers, like maintenance guys who actually help you during your disaster, who clean up your building and things, they may be mums and dads kind of suppliers, small suppliers. And they, you know, you should really treat almost like your own staff in a sense. So you should also pay them quicker, make sure they can get by. They have families to feed, you know. So the bigger end of town is usually more flexible because they know that eventually you'll pay them because you've paid them for years and they don't have a shortage of cash. But some of your smaller vendors and also your staff, they may be much more in need for immediate payment. I hope that all makes sense. I mentioned RPOs before. Now we also have RTOs. And we're going to look in this slide, what is the difference? So RTO is your recovery time objective. And that is going forward, we've talked about MTPDs, right? The tolerable period of disruption stated by the business divisions. What we're trying to do with RTO is at least match that with all the different resources that particular division needs for those time-critical activities. So, for example, if I've worked out that a time-critical process is, for Vodafone, is servicing business customers for their telephony needs. We may have seen then in 5 or 6 or 7 departments that a role in there. So that was this little diagram here. Sorry. In this diagram, we've said, okay, for example, the process of what did we say? Providing telephony services to customers, maybe something like this. You know, we might have ticked 2 different departments that play a role in there, maybe sales and the call center. What we then do is next, we're going to say which activities are actually required for that. You know, what do these departments do? What do they need? How quickly they need it? Critical timings. Then if it works out that the financial impacts of a disruption are big enough and we justify in here, for example, if a corporate customer doesn't get telephony for 4 hours or a day, that's a huge financial impact for that customer, huge reputational impact for Vodafone, you know, so that's not acceptable. So there's probably quite a short time frame on that one. And that means, for example, if that time frame is 4 hours, you need the systems behind it to then recover that process within those 4 hours. And those systems might be your phone system. You know, Vodafone might have their own phone system that they use for talking to their corporate customers. It may be some technology, some ICT, some data center space, whatever it is, some data that has been backed up. And all of that has to be available soon enough to match that particular maximum tolerable period of disruption. So the MTPD is stated by the business based on the justifications we saw here. Yeah, we've said the business can say maybe 2 business days, 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever, based on their manual workarounds. And in here, we're now going to say the responders to that, so ICT and facilities and security, whoever, they are going to match, ideally, that particular MTPD with the right RTOs of the critical resources they manage. So if I work in ICT and I need to provide a system to my Vodafone staff who work in the corporate division, I'm going to keep that MTPD in mind, knowing all the resources required potentially include things like an ICT application that they use, that the staff are using. So that one I need a fairly short RTO on, yeah? Whereas RPO is a whole different thing. Yeah, RPO is about data backups, the frequency, how much data loss can you handle? Completely different dimension, and I'll come up with some examples in a minute where you guys can hopefully help me with, you know, what is the difference there. So another thing I wanted to say about RTOs, they have to be smart objectives. You can't just let the business write down RTOs of certain critical resources, you know, of critical applications and critical seating and mobile phones and handsets and whatever. You know, you need to have realistic RTOs, and they have to be tested and tried by the people who manage them, like ICT, facilities, etc., not by the business. The business cannot determine, oh, RTO for email should be 3 hours. RTOs should be tested and actually realistic, not just written down in documents, and so there's unrealistic expectations. No, we don't want that. We want the RTOs to be determined by people from IT and facilities who actually test those RTOs, to test the recovery process. So if I work in ICT and I know that an application will take 6 hours to recover, but the MTPD of certain processes that require that application is 4 hours, you know, then I know I've got a gap. I'm not going to be able to recover soon enough for that business division to be happy, or the multiple business divisions to be happy, you know, to meet that MTPD. So there's 2 things you can then do then. One is make that MTPD longer. So if ask the business and say, do you have any more manual workarounds? Can you make them last longer? Because my RTO is really quite a lot longer. It's 6 hours, not 4. Can you do something to continue your manual workarounds? And if the answer from the business is no, we need that email system within 4 hours, well, then ICT should ask for an investment there, right? Not just running around like crazy. No, actually saying, well, if you need that to be shortened, well, what are you happy to commit? Yeah, because I have other IT staff running around here. They also need to do other things. It's not just your system we're working on. We're working on lots of other things. I can't just shorten that RTO somehow. It's going to take 6 hours, you know. So what are you going to do? You know, are you going to seek some further investment so that we in ICT can then invest in that and have quicker recovery times? I'm hoping you get the dynamic here, because what I see in reality, ICT are sort of running around, putting RTOs to things. The business actually saying, no, that RTO is wrong. You know, they're actually feeding the RTO levels. ICT are looking at that going, oh my goodness, I've got like 15 time-critical systems with all different RTOs. How am I even going to manage recovering all of that stuff if all of them were down, the whole data center flooded, or we had a cyber attack, for example? How are we going to recover all of that stuff? Because individual RTOs are one thing, but now all of them together, recovering all of that stuff is going to be another thing, right? And often you find that people are not ready in ICT to handle that kind of big impact, large scale kind of scenario. So once again, it should be a dialogue between the business and ICT, the business and facilities, the business and people like telephony services to actually get that agreed and aligned. Now, I'd like to ask you guys to comment in the chat about the following. I'm looking for an example of a system, an ICT system, where there is a short or not really, no, actually a short RTO, yeah, a short RTO, and a not important or long RPO. So the RPO we don't really care about. It's long, it could be months, it could be weeks. But the RTO is super short. So I'd like you to think about what that means. Yeah, a short RTO means the recovery time objective is short. So you need to recover that system really quickly. On the other hand, the RPO can be long. That means the data on it is either not so important, or it can be old. It can be maybe remembered by staff manually in their head, and we don't need to back that system up so frequently. Give me an example of a system. Could be in your own organization, any particular system, and I'm talking about a functional sort of terminology here, right? Like so a system that manages whatever, payroll, for example, or finance. So come up with a system there that has a short RTO, a short recovery time objective, and a non-existent or long, non-important, I should say, not important RPO or very long RPO. Data backups can be not frequent, you know, but the RTO is very short. I'd like an example of a system there. So please type in the chat. Not that easy, this question, yeah, and you're most welcome to think about it for a moment. Yeah, which type of system would be, have to be available really, really quickly, but the data can be old or restored, you know, from, I don't know, backups or something. It can be, it's not really important. Yeah, interesting. Systems for generating purchase order numbers. So that's a comment here from Firdaus. You've sent it to all panelists. I'm not sure if that's the whole group, but I'm reading it out anyway. So Firdaus is saying the system for generating PO numbers. So you need that up very quickly because it's part of your emergency purchasing procedure. For example, if you quickly need PO numbers to then be able to, in an incident, for people to purchase urgent products. I'm assuming that's what you're thinking there. That's true that it could have a very short RTO and a long RPO, but that does mean that you have to remember those RPOs somehow from historically. And that I kind of doubt, because I would almost say with that one, it's a short RTO, but also a short RPO, because can you remember a day later or a week later, what were the last backup RPOs, like as in what were the last backup PO numbers, purchase order numbers? That could be tricky, unless you have a manual process next to your normal computer that all day long you're always writing those things down, or you're sending it to people outside the organization, for example, to suppliers, and you think, oh, if an incident happens, I will have my PO number generating system up and running, but the old PO numbers, oh, I can just ask my suppliers what the PO numbers were. If that's the case, okay, I agree. But in my experience, that's not always the case, because it's between businesses. You know, you're actually going to ask an external supplier for the PO number. It's kind of, maybe it sounds a bit unprofessional if you don't have that backed up yourself. So I agree with the short RTO, but the RPO, you may need fairly short as well to back up those PO numbers during the, or before the disaster happens. A telephony system, absolutely, that's the one. Yeah, that's the sort of thing I'm looking for. Telephony system, or another one is monitoring systems. So if I have CCTV monitoring, you know, camera monitoring, or environmental monitoring in a data center or something like that, or alert systems, you know, usually if nothing has happened, you know, it's not the data on it, it's backed up and it's saved, etc. But usually it's not that critical. Yeah, and if it's not backed up to the moment, unless it's related to the incident, you know, like if you need to look at system logs during a cyber attack, for example, for those sorts of things, it is time critical, you know, and it's also, the RPO is also short. You need that data to be backed up, you know, the monitoring of the logs, because in case of a real incident, a data breach or something, you need to quickly look what were the latest, you know, backed up issues, you know, or logs that you can actually review. So telephony system is great, monitoring systems generally as well, CCTV, those sorts of things. Yeah, and like I said, only CCTV is only the exception is if there was really a break-in, you know, into that building. That's the only scenario where you would say you need that data to be backed up, you know, all the time. So if the system breaks and you can't, you know, look at those tapes, you know, for example, that might be a thing there. But telephony, absolutely, I think there's usually, if the building gets, you know, unavailable or the systems go down and you didn't back up to the last minute what conversations were held, yeah, I think that's quite acceptable, you know. So that's a good one. Now the opposite, I'd like you to think about as well, and I'll give you examples for that one. That is when there is a very short RPO. That means you need to back up very frequently, all the time. There may be a very high transactional volume on it or something, or a system where you cannot remember what it was if the system, you know, breaks down. You won't be able to retrieve what the latest data that was inserted. So that would be a short RPO, very frequent backups, but a long RTO. That means a very long recovery time objective. You don't need that system very quickly. Yeah, so that's when you do need the data, but if the system is not available for the first couple of days or weeks, you don't really care. An example of that might be, you know, those people who book concerts in advance, like for example, Ticketek, it's called in Australia. But you know, they're companies that actually do pre-bookings for concerts. For example, I don't know, can't say Michael Jackson, but you know, let's say Guns N' Roses are coming to KL next year, and you can now buy tickets. Now that service online to book those tickets, if that goes down and it's still a year before the concert, you know, you don't need that system to be up and running the same, you know, next second perhaps, depending on the revenue that it's going to lose, you know. But if those people are so hooked on Guns N' Roses, you know, they can probably make the booking for the ticket next week and they'll still be keen to do that. So the RTO can be quite long for that one. But the RPO is all the recent transactions on it. Now that's important to back up to the minute, right? Because when you finally then recover that system, you do want the recent data on it, the purchases of the tickets that people have made. So that's just a little example of one of those. Yeah, and then there's systems that have short RTO and short RPO. Yeah, and also the opposite, you know, long of both. Now the short RTO and the short RPO are all your high availability systems like banking, online banking systems, where you've got people transacting all the time. So the RTO has to be short. You have to bring that system up as soon as possible, especially if you've got 24/7 type activity on there. And you need the data be up to the minute too, because you won't remember how many transactions every customer has done, you know. There's too many transactions. So high volume transaction type systems, they usually have an RTO and an RPO that are fairly short, especially if there's a business need to bring that system up very quickly. So I hope that makes sense. Now you understand what is the RPO and the RTO, and they're completely independent dimensions. Yeah? Here you can see a little example of RPOs, what different provisions you have there. So backup tapes, usually we're talking every 7 days, you usually send them off site and you bring them back and you do the backups. Network backups you usually do every night, you know. So that's 7 days, this is 24 hours. And then you've got mirrored systems that could be up to the minute, depending on the capacity of your network pipes, you know, like because up to the second gets pretty difficult, I've noticed. So you might lose a few bits and pieces of data on that one. Now this is also immediately related to cost. Yeah, you'd like to have everything as a mirrored system, but you won't be able to afford it most likely. So you need to have something maybe on nightly backups and some things on tape. And tapes are getting a bit out of date, but there's still quite a few clients that I work with that actually use them. I don't know about you guys, but yeah, we use them quite a lot still. Now the next slide shows everything in an overview. You know, we have the moment of an incident occurring. Then going back in time, we have hopefully backed up successfully some data on that system. Now, if we go forward in time, yeah, then we have, first of all, we need to somehow invoke a plan or a partial invocation of the BCP or the DR plan. So there's some decision making going on here. Then when that moment has come that we actually make a decision, from that point on, IT and facilities type people are going to start restoring. Before that, they're probably not allowed, you know, and it's too risky too. If you start restoring your system in your backup site, for example, and suddenly it seems like it was false alarm and the business actually, the disruption only lasted for half an hour, bringing that system back to normal can sometimes be far more complex and disruptive than the initial bringing it over, flicking the switch to go to recovery modus. So you want to be fairly careful with that, and therefore that disaster declaration, decision making, and so on. The initial decision making is fairly important to do it properly, and it won't be usually a matter of minutes. There's often quite a bit of time involved there. So the RTO then kicks in, and at some stage you'll have business processes have available this current data. Your systems, your business can start using that. But beforehand, you have probably a moment when the systems are up and running and the data is still being restored. So the sequence in time is the incident occurs, the disaster is declared or the BCP invoked, then there's a moment when the systems are ready, and then the data is restored. And all of that stuff here up the top, so between the disaster being declared and your business being available with current data, is RTO. Then there is resumed business, so we continue on and we now say we're resuming business operations in that modus. Some stage there'll be main or new facilities restored, could be a new data center if the previous one was burnt down, could be a building that's found somewhere else, or you go back to your old building if it's now available, that kind of thing. Then there's usually a period of backlog processing. So all the things you've been doing manually, you now need to put back in the system somehow. You need to maybe hire someone for that, or, you know, to type all those transactions in. And then there's detecting future disruption. So that's the timeline we've got here. And MTPD, unfortunately, is by default not actually the same as RTO. So remember I mentioned earlier to say, you know, we need to have the RTO at least sort of matching your MTPD. That decision making is the little hint here that you want some margin here. You don't want them to exactly match the RTO and the MTPD, because you will be losing time initially with getting or waiting for a decision to invoke that plan, the DR plan in this case, for a system. And that's when your RTO kicks in. So unfortunately, if you don't communicate this photo, this picture to the business, they will think, hey, and email, someone told me the RTO in email is 3 hours. IT told me that somewhere, that they confirmed that it's 3 hours. Awesome. If I have an incident at 9 o'clock in the morning, at 12 o'clock, I can start hassling IT. But hold on, the decision-making period is there, right? So the business staff should understand this picture and not hassle IT before that decision has been made and then the RTO has been passed. Yeah, I hope this makes sense. And we've got a few IT people in the group. Saravana, for example, I'm hoping you recognize this dynamic where if you don't communicate this, you'll be hassled very quickly, you know, by the business saying, hey, what's the RTO on email? 3 hours? Okay, give me that system with my data and everything else, you know. Whereas what you know is, hold on, there is also some time involved in assessing the incident, and especially with cyber. when we talk about cyber attacks and data breaches, the first hours, sometimes days, we don't even know exactly what the impact is. We don't even know what exactly happened or how many systems are affected. So that decision-making period and the assessment of it could be a lot longer than you're used to. So that's what will stretch then, your time frame of recovery, and the MTPD hopefully is long enough. So business can use manual workarounds up to that level. We have a quick look if there's anything in the chat. No, not yet. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, you're most welcome to chat here because especially, like I said, for ICT, I hope this all makes sense, that time frame and the expectations of customers and how that dynamic works. Now, this is just a final sort of bit on BIA and risk assessment to show the difference there. Basically BIA is looking at your business functions and the effect that a business disruption might have upon them, whereas risk assessment is looking at the overall process of risk identification, risk analysis, and evaluation. And one activity happens in both, and that is the assessment of impacts. Now, we looked at the assessment of impacts based on financial and other kind of impacts and different criteria. In risk assessment, we look at impacts based on each incident-specific impacts, like, for example, a fire, a flood, air explosion. What are the impact ratings, especially? And not so much the overall business impact, but more a individual incident. What is the rating of that impact? How bad is that? But in our business impact analysis, we're going to look at impact more as an end-to-end kind of rating. How bad is it for my end-to-end business processes? So in our risk matrix from step 2, we chose this approach to put the impacts actually at the business level, because otherwise you're getting a whole heap of different impacts for each of the incidents. And eventually you're going to look at really the consequence anyway, the consequence, that the scenario that it belongs to. So we actually find that having one impact rating for a whole consequence scenario, but likelihood ratings for each incident. Because the likelihood of a flood or an explosion or a gas leak, they're fundamentally very different. Yeah? So in our risk matrix that we used yesterday, there was one column where we rated likelihood. That should be really incident specific for each threat, for each of those elements there. Now, the big picture here is, let me have a quick look at the time. Yeah, we've got a little bit of time before coffee. The big picture here is a dramatic increase or decrease in customer demand due to a crisis. So could you use your work area recovery site for overflow is one question there, because you might have, if an incident happens like, for example, a pandemic, COVID-19, medical supplies were overloaded, as in the medical providers. For example, whether it was, medical service over the phone, or whether it was masks or hand sanitizers or anything to do with medical supplies, vitamin C, and any other kind of medical / pharmacy related sort of products. And they didn't just need a BCP to bring them back to BAU. They needed a BCP that brought them to double or triple capacity. Am I making sense here? Yeah, it's not like you just need a plan to help you get back to your normal daily business. For some scenarios, your business will be needing to provide 4 times the normal level of service because there's so much more demand. The other thing happens as well. The other thing happens, for example, KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, during the bird flu, they were activating their BCP, like get back up and running, make sure we've got all our staff there and our systems and our food. But people in many regions didn't want to eat chicken because they had this weird feeling about, maybe I'll get the bird flu if I go to KFC and eat chicken, So hopefully that makes sense. People just didn't want to buy their product. So even though their BCP could help them back to BAU, back to daily business, it wasn't actually needed because nobody needed to buy their products. So that's some examples where increase and decrease can happen in customer demand due to a specific crisis or business disruption. And like I said, if it's an increase in demand, you might actually use your work area recovery site, your remote site, not just if the main building is down, but actually to expand your capacity, to quickly get extra staff, extra call center staff, for example, or extra warehouse staff, and work from that secondary site in parallel to your main site. So that's a good thought, isn't it? Like it doesn't just have to cater for if your main building is gone. Now, there's another couple of questions here that are the big picture questions. You know, if a crisis occurs, is it worth reinstating certain parts of the business? There are certain products or services that you may be phasing out. I know businesses where they're making certain products that are, you know, next year really they're not producing those anymore because they're not going to be in demand, or it's not part of their corporate strategy to continue that service or product. Now, if a disaster strikes tomorrow, are they going to invest to the highest degree to reinstate that particular part of the business? Probably not. They're probably going to train the staff quickly to work for the other part of the business as backups, and hopefully get the staff working straight away and increase the capacity of that part of the business, you know, and actually increase the sales there as well, and phase out the other part of that business that was not so critical anymore in the near future. So that's that part. And then the third one there is reputation enhancement opportunities due to a crisis. I also see businesses that, due to a particular incident, they can actually really help organizations get back on their feet. For example, there's an insurance company in Australia where they help businesses now, small businesses especially, with if there's a flood or a fire or if there's IT failures, you know, or power failures. They say, we help quickly with generators, for example, little mini generators that we actually wheel into a certain community if there's been a major impact on their power supply. And what happens then is, first of all, everybody's pleasantly surprised to see the insurance company coming up with those sorts of tools. Their reputation goes up. And the second thing is the claims coming through from those particular clients that work there can be either lower or not even happening. So maybe they're not actually needing support because the generator has helped them continue their business. So that's a really cool initiative, you know, from one of the insurance companies in Australia where they're helping business actually recover or, you know, continue their work. And in the meantime, they actually reduce the chance of claims. So it actually pays for itself in many ways. And the extra cherry on top is that their reputation, you know, is enhanced because people now see them as really helpful rather than, oh, insurance companies, you know, they're just wanting my premiums, and if I put a claim in, I never get a payment, you know. That actually, that's sort of the vibe around insurance companies sometimes. So, yeah, that's you know, that's what I wanted to tell you about that. And we've got a couple of people from the insurance angle here. I know that Harry works in insurance, so you probably recognize some of these things. And it could be a really cool corporate strategy to help businesses through that kind of disaster and then enhance the reputation of your business as well. Okay, now final 2 slides and then we'll go to coffee. Big picture impacts of essential service interruptions could be, if you're looking at a map here of any community, critical infrastructure in that community could be banking and finance, comms, energy and water, food chain, health, emergency services, and transport, you know, also mass gatherings, so actually people getting together. Now this map, you can see it's not just these individual services here. You see that there's interlinkages between every single one of these. There's a dependency between every single one. And this is just a big picture of what you could find in terms of impacts, right? You do it for your own business or your time critical process, but the city or your state or the state around Kuala Lumpur, for example, the city government would do these sorts of things and look at if one thing was down, what would be the impact? Now, the problem is losing one of those services, for example, energy and water, it impacts on 6 of these connections, right? So because energy and water has 6 other impacts on all these other 6 other elements. And what you actually find is it's not just that one service being down, but actually 28% of all the perceived services being affected. So a community feels, even if 1 out of 7 is down, they feel an impact of 28%, like a third of their daily life is disrupted. And losing 2 of them, you're already hitting above half. So that's where the community really gets really heavy impact and cannot function properly. Yeah, so hopefully that gives you some idea of when you're planning this for city councils and so on, you're actually needing to look at a big picture there and how you, and some of you may have worked in government roles like that before, where you're looking at the community impact, not just your own individual business impact. I've just run a session actually virtually at distance with one of my consultants on site for the City of Sydney Council, which is the biggest, council around Sydney that manages the Opera House and all of that. And yeah, we actually looked at all of this and looked at what the community impacts of COVID were and how we can, help the community further. So it's not just their internal business, that they need to look at their own staff and all of that, but also at what are we producing? What are we actually, doing for the community around us? I hope that was of interest. We're going to get a discussion happening after coffee. I could start making the breakout sessions during the coffee break, if you don't mind. So if you guys take 15 minutes break now, I will set up those breakout groups, and you guys can have a discussion. And the discussion mission is, for us at the coffee break, is how to get buy-in for BCP. I've heard quite a few of you guys say that it's pretty hard to get people enthusiastic about it, if it's at top level, medium, or low. I shared some slides yesterday. Remember to say, how can you get enthusiasm from all those levels? So I'd like you guys to have a discussion on that. So we'll have a coffee break for 15 minutes, and then you can continue for 10 minutes or so on that discussion. You can start straight away, or you can start in 5 minutes time, whatever you want to do. But if at least you're back within 15 minutes after your coffee break, that would be great, because then you guys have 10 minutes more to discuss. Breakout sessions. Most of you were very, very active. I was eavesdropping in all the sessions regularly. So thank you for initiating also things like the whiteboard and the chat, because those tools are available within WebEx, as you could see. The tool that you were looking at earlier in your breakout session that has some options at the top. So yeah, I thought maybe we can hear from a couple of participants. Can I just go down the alphabetic list? And if possible, Amina, would you be able to share a little bit about what you guys discussed in your breakout session, please?
Okay. Hi. Our salient points that we were saying about just now is to get the top management buy-in. Perhaps we could talk about the business resiliency of our company and how our company could adapt to the crisis in the event there's a crisis, and how with BCP, safety of our employees' life and assets during crisis. I mean, we can go on board on saving our employees' life and assets during a crisis, and then we can gain back confidence of our stakeholders, managing stakeholders' interests, clients, shareholders, and investors with good BCP. And during our top management buy-in, also we can talk about the success and failure stories, how in the event of a crisis, which will affect us if we go unprepared.
Yeah, very good. There's some really good thoughts, and as you did really well, is look at all levels of the organization, not just the staff, or not just the top management, because they all have different drivers, don't they? Like they have different expectations. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And the next team, Harry, would you be able to take the lead for that one, please? Sorry, just a second. I'll just unmute you. Harry, can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. As I was discussing with my teammates earlier, so the buy-in was not difficult with the middle level management or the senior level management, but it was a difficult buy-in from the general staff, because they do not see it as a key process or key function, or BCP as a key function, but rather than an additional job which is not, they are being paid for. Yeah, so there's an additional burden where they have to participate or provide their inputs. So there was a difficulty for us as the BCP team to get the accurate and comprehensive information, especially during the BIA exercise or the risk assessment exercise. So what we did previously was that we actually appointed a PC coordinator, and we made BCP as their KPI.
Mm-hmm.
So each contribution corporation from them will give them a 5% KPI to the annual performance. So from that point onwards, there was a good buy-in from the 1.5 or the BC coordinator, but there was a cut-off kind of a communication between the 1.5 or the BC coordinator with their department staff or the branch staff. So what we are planning is that when with the next session we'll be involving the head of department or the head of the branch also in our session. So before the BIA exercise, we will do a briefing. So we will include them in this briefing. So they will know the importance of BIA exercise, how accurate information should be given. Because during our COVID-19 pandemic, before 2 days before the government's announcement on MCO, we had a difficulty of identifying the additional staff required for recovery process. So moving forward, I think from this experience, they will know how important it is. So we will be able to get more buy-in from them.
Yeah,
that's all. Thanks.
Very good. Thanks for sharing. With the KPIs or even just performance appraisals and for staff to have some little component there that they can actually, maybe get a salary increase if it's part of the same discussion, their performance appraisal, that BCP is in there somewhere in whatever shape or form. It's a really good idea, I think. Go on.
But there's not any salary increment, just a KPI. Yeah, that's normal, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm just saying you could get there all the way, with that they actually see more cash in the bank if they actually do good participation in exercises and maintenance and all that. So, but I know what you mean. Even KPIs could be already helping a lot with that. Another thing is with general staff, really emphasize, for example, how important is BCP for payroll? How important is it for them to get communicated to if there's an incident that they can, for example, go home and work from there for the rest of the week or something? If they don't want that information and if they don't think salary payments are important, I mean, that's quite unusual. Most of them will see, you just have to translate those benefits to their life. Because if, like you said, if they just think it's a waste of time and that it's for someone else's benefit, for the corporate profit or something, then you've got that issue. But so that's what I would do. And also, you could use actual examples also from the same industry and other businesses that have had problems where staff are really affected, to really show those benefits. But you guys are on the right track there, and thank you for sharing, Harry. That was great. You had a big team too. You had 4 people to discuss, I think. So that was really good. Thank you. And then Iswan, let's see. Savannah, Iswan, and Noor, you guys were team 3. Let me just see if Iswan actually was managing to get into the session. You were, right? Islam was. Let me just give you the words. Just a moment. Oops. Too many screens in front of me. Islam. Islam, are you able to share with us what you guys discussed? I think I can hear you now.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello. Yes, we are discussing about the top-down approach as well as the comprehensiveness of the BCP. I think this is the collaborative effort within the organization as well as the other departments. So I think the comprehensiveness as well as the collaborative effort will produce the better BCP for the organization.
Yeah, fantastic. Top-down approach, I really agree, because it makes sense, people they see the same language from BCP that they see in the corporate website and annual reports and everything. The top-down approach is really about having the formulating of processes in a certain way that everybody can understand it, that it makes business sense, not just internal BCP people, language. It should be really corporate language. So. Thank you for sharing this one, and Team Steve. I hope you guys all were able, I know that 9 out of 10 of you guys were able to jump into those breakout sessions successfully. Yeah, just if there's any problems with that in the future, whatever, you can always also chat in the plenary chat, right? If you have something to share in there, and we can also use that in our recap next time if you like. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Let me go and share my screen again. So I actually shared during the lunch break, I shared our results from yesterday, you know, the little exercise we did as a group about COVID lessons learned with the sticky note board.